Hi, everyone. This is the 50 States Highpointing podcast and YouTube channel. What started off as a project for a communications class has turned into something that I actually love doing. I have the privilege of providing the platform for people to talk about the extraordinary things they do in the outdoors. Highpointing is the challenge of reaching the highest elevation in each of the 50 states. Highpointers don't get paid for their hobby. No one is sponsored by an outdoor company, and people fit this challenge into their everyday lives that also include careers and family. I found through these interviews that people who attempt this challenge are incredible and genuinely enjoy talking about their experiences. If you consider yourself a highpointer and you want to share your story on this podcast or interview, please send me an email at 50stateshighpointingpodcast@gmail.com. It has been a pleasure speaking with every highpointer. I hope you enjoy. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 50 States Highpointing Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren, and today we're speaking with James from New York State. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So can you tell our listeners a little bit about your life in the outdoors and what got you highpointing?
So highpointing came my late 20s, I guess. I'm a big fan of national parks.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to get to all the national parks. I'm at 43 out of 63 currently. And I spent 5 years living in Texas. And one week, a coworker and I planned a trip out to Big Bend, Guadalupe Mountains, and Carlsbad Caverns. Mm-hmm. And of course, Guadalupe Mountains is home to Guadalupe Peak, the high point of Texas. And at the time, it was just kind of this quirky thing to do. Like, oh, we're at the highest point in Texas. Like, yeah, we're the highest people in Texas. And didn't think too much of it at the time until I moved back home to New York the following year. And I thought it would be interesting to do the high point of the two states I've lived in, Texas and New York.
Okay.
So soon after, I planned a trip for Mount Marcy. And while I was planning that, looking at the atlas, I noticed Mount Mansfield in Vermont is kind of just over the border from, not that close, but they're close enough to Mount Marcy. I'm like, oh, maybe I'll make a weekend of it. So I did Mount Marcy on a Saturday and Mount Mansfield on a Sunday. And it was really, I think, Mansfield where I thought, I guess this is just something I'm doing now.
Oh, cool.
So it kind of sparked my interest in, looking into it more and seeing what all the high points were like.
Wow, that's really cool. So how was Mount Marcy for you? Because I get a lot of people on the podcast that were like, that was insane. It was super long, or the weather was crazy. It was the longest day.
It was a long day. It was sun up to sundown for me because I like to spend some time at the summit. And it was in summer, so it was a long day, and I had beautiful weather. And anyone that's hiked in the Adirondacks, like not just Mount Marcy, but any of the high peaks region, those trails are just nuts. And it's like they were designed by MC Escher. They're just like boulders, and they have all these zigzags. And like, there's a thing in New York called the 46. So it's the 46 highest peaks in the Adirondacks.
Okay.
And people try to check them off. I've done 15 of them so far. And each one is, you just get to a point in the trail where you look ahead and you're like, what the hell is this? This is insane.
Yeah.
And so Marcy is just that, but longer. It's 7 miles one way. So
wow.
It's a long day. But I did it. I had a good day for it.
Perfect. So how many high points do you have?
40. Texas was my first, and my most current one is Eagle Mountain in Minnesota.
Can you tell the listeners about some of the most memorable moments you've had while highpointing?
Um, so two that come to mind are Idaho and Montana. So Idaho, I was on the summit for the 2017 Great American Eclipse.
Wow.
So I was actually on not the very, very summit because there was already people up there. So I was like, I don't know, like maybe 10, 20 feet below the summit.
Okay.
But I was up there for the eclipse, and that was just mind-bogglingly awesome.
Yeah, I bet.
Because you were up so high that you could actually see the shadow of the moon approaching the mountain, and then it hit, and it's just like somebody turned the lights off. It got really dark and cold, and the shadow passed over, and I think we had 2-something minutes, or no, between 2 and 4 minutes of totality before the trailing edge passed us.
Okay.
And then when it did pass, you could see the shadow just moving on to the east. That was really, really cool.
Yeah.
And there was, I estimated between 150 and 200 people on the summit of Mount Bora to watch this.
Wow.
So anyone that's been up there can probably try to imagine like 200 people crowding the summit and the little summit ridge that goes off to the south, I think.
Wow. All for that event.
It was like a big party.
That's cool.
I saw somebody get proposed to.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. After first contact of the eclipse, but before totality, some guy proposed to his girlfriend at the summit.
Cool.
And then Montana, I did a guided hike. And so there was a group of 6 climbers, 2 guides, and 2 porters. And so that was something I had trained for, leading up to it. And we were, I think, 3 days in the backcountry. So we were camping up on Froze to Death Plateau and, getting an alpine start for the summit. I got a little altitude sickness, not bad. Like on our way back from the summit, I started getting sick, but it passed fairly quickly. The final approach to the summit is technical climbing. So you're some harnesses, which I had started indoor rock climbing just to get, to train for.
Okay.
Which is something I still do to this day. And that was in 2016, I think I did Granite Peak. Yeah, so that was a really cool experience. Living with mountain goats around your campsite.
Really?
Like, oh yeah. Like
wow.
Because we had 2 different campsites. One when you first get on the Froze to Death Plateau, and then one at the far end, like before you go over the saddle to Granite.
Okay.
And so I saw some mountain goats at the edge of the plateau on our first morning. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. And, I kind of walked down, tried to get as close as I could. And, try not to scare them off. And, I got some cool picture of them. And then I went back and told the guide about it. And he's like, oh, yeah, they're all over the place. Like, and he was like, did they drink your pee? I'm like, no. And I thought he was just like teasing. But they do that. So we got to our second campsite, and the goats are just like always around the perimeter of your camp. And when you leave to go pee, they will follow you and start licking it off the rocks.
Wow. For the salt, I would imagine.
Yeah. Like to the point where you sometimes have to adjust your aim so you're not peeing on the goats.
Wow. No one has ever talked about that before.
Sometimes they'll run through camp. They're not shy.
Doesn't sound like it. That is so funny. Wow. That's certainly memorable.
Yeah, so that's an interesting experience.
Mm-hmm. What about some East Coast peaks?
So Mount Rogers in Virginia. Of course, it's famous for its herds of ponies.
Yeah.
So we didn't see any on the way to the summit, but on the way back, we were running into several small herds of them. And, you're not supposed to pet them, but they will come up to you. A lot of times, like, I had one start nibbling on my boot as I was standing there. So they're really cute. Okay.
Can you talk about some more memorable moments throughout high pointing?
Yeah, so my first failed attempt was Mount Katahdin, or just Katahdin, in Maine. I was there for my first convention. I think it was 2013, but I'm not positive on that.
Okay.
So a couple of us from the hotel drove into the park, and you couldn't get into the park until after a certain time. Like, Baxter State Park is very restrictive about when they open their gates, and it's a little bit of a pain. But
okay.
So we got a little bit later start than we would have liked, and we were going to do the Knife's Edge, which is a famous feature of Katahdin. So it's a very sheer-sided ridge connecting Pomola Peak with Katahdin. And we got to Pomola Peak, and you could see Katahdin, at the other end of the Knife's Edge. And behind Katahdin was dark storm clouds. So one of the guys in the group just happened to be, at the time, he wrote the safety articles for the club newsletter. But it was like, yeah, we need to not do this. So unfortunately, we had to turn back, and it was, I think, 5 years later before my second attempt, and which was successful. Probably my worst experience would be Mount Elbert in Colorado.
Okay.
So it was a beautiful day. It was October, so it was nice and cold. But being from upstate New York, like, the cold and snow didn't really bother me too much.
Mm-hmm.
I had a partner climbing with me. She made a fair distance, but then at a certain point, like, she kind of wasn't having it, so she turned back. I decided to keep going, and I got just below the summit when my stomach turned just a little bit.
Oh.
And I just kind of, like, tried to ignore it, and because I felt fine other than that. It was just like a second, like, okay, I'm better.
Mm-hmm.
So I got the summit. I took my pictures. I was taking in the view, having a good time. And then when I went to come back down, I got just below the summit, and that feeling kicked in again. And it didn't go away this time. And it was a very long walk back down, because basically I was stopping once an hour to get sick.
Oh, no.
I threw up once, and then I just kept dry heaving after that. And we had camped at the tree line, which is at about 11,500. We'd spent one night in Leadville at 10,000, one night at tree line at 11,500. And I was hoping that would be enough to acclimate a little bit. But it took me 4 hours to get from the summit back down to the tree line. And I know people do Elbert in a day, like as a day hike. It's not technically difficult or anything, but like, I just felt miserable. Mm-hmm. And I finally got back to the tent, and our plan was we were going to summit, get back to the tent, pack up, and head out. Well, I got back to the tent, and I'm like, I'm not going anywhere. I felt awful. My partner said I looked green. So I climbed into the tent, and just, I couldn't keep anything down. Didn't eat anything for the whole rest of the day.
Yeah.
Barely drank anything. I should have toughed through it and hiked out to get lower, but man, I was just whipped.
Yeah.
And then the next morning, like I felt a lot better. We hiked out and wound up getting a big breakfast back in Leadville. So I was feeling much better, but man, that summit day was awful.
Yeah.
The summit itself was great, but it was after, on the way back down is when it really kicked my butt.
For sure. Did you go really fast that day?
No, I'm not a speed hiker going uphill. On flats I can motor pretty good, but going uphill I bog right down. So I was kind of taking my time.
Yeah. So that happened to me on Humphreys Peak, and I was just going faster than I should have. I should have just taken it a little more steady pace. And I didn't drink any water or eat anything. And it didn't kick in. Well, first it was a migraine that kicked in on the way down. And by the time I realized that I was dehydrated, it's too late. And I drank all the water I had, but it wasn't enough. And I ended up puking when I got down. That was awful.
When I got sick on Granite Peak in Montana, I did throw up once, got a headache, but Elbert was just way worse. It just took me out for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
I got my sleeping bag and that was it.
So high pointing takes us places where we wouldn't normally find ourselves. And I know a lot of people that I've spoken with have a lot of memories from road trips that they've taken. Can you tell us any stories about the trips that you've made throughout your high pointing endeavor?
A lot of times I'll try to incorporate my national parks on a trip. So last year's Pennsylvania convention, on the way down, we stopped at Flight 93 National Memorial.
Oh, wow.
Johnstown Flood National Memorial.
Yeah.
Fort Necessity. Falling Water, the Frank Lloyd Wright House.
Wow.
Is really close. So
yeah.
I look for those places and try not to make it just about the high point.
Mm-hmm.
So or when I did the Idaho trip for the eclipse, I did Idaho, and I had planned on doing Kings Peak in Utah the same week. But Idaho was a lot, it took a lot more out of me than I was expecting.
Yeah.
It's really steep. It's stupid steep. And I'd gotten hot spots on my feet, and that kind of kicked my butt a little. Plus the forecast for Kings wasn't that great. So instead of going to Kings, I did a last minute trip to Great Basin National Park and Bryce Canyon National Park.
Oh, perfect. Wow.
Checked off 2 national parks instead, which was
That's
amazing.
awesome.
Great Basin is amazing.
Yeah. Isn't that one of the dark sky national parks?
Yes. I was camping at Wheeler Peak Campground. So there's a Wheeler Peak in Nevada, not to be confused with the High Point of New Mexico.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes. So Wheeler, Nevada is the second highest point. It's in the national park, and it's the second highest point in the state. So I was at the campground, and I had heard about the dark skies, and I wanted to try and do some night photography. And when I went to bed one night, the clouds had rolled in, so you couldn't really see the skies that well. But then later in the night, I had to get up to use the restroom, and I crawled out of the tent and looked up, and the clouds had gone, and it was one of the most amazing night skies I've ever seen. It was just
wow.
There were so many stars out. It was amazing.
Wow.
There was no moon because the eclipse was just a few days before, so it was still a new moon. And yeah, it was just unreal stars. You could see the Milky Way, and yeah. and Bryce Canyon was really cool. Hiking through the amphitheater, like through all the hoodoos.
So, how long have you been a member of the Highpointers Club?
I guess I joined. I think it was 2013, if I remember correctly, or 2012, something like that. When I went to my first convention, and I've been to every convention since then.
That's cool.
Up through Pennsylvania last year. Yeah, I show my work at the conventions, and I've contributed to the newsletter on occasion with photos and an article or two.
Can you tell the listeners about the photography that you contribute?
Yeah, so my specialty is doing 360-degree panoramas of landscapes, and one of those subjects I like to shoot is the high points. So I'll get to the summit, or as close as I can get to the summit, and do a 360-degree panorama, which usually consists of a dozen, 15 shots that I take. I just stand in a spot and take a shot, turn a little bit, take another shot, turn, until I get all the way around me. And then I stitch them together in Photoshop and print them at my local lab. And they're 8 inches tall by 60-ish inches long. Each one's a little different, but on average about 60 inches from end to end. So I do the high points, and I do national parks and some other interesting landscapes.
Yeah.
Even, they don't even have to be scenic. Like, anyone that's been to the Rhode Island High Point, it's a rock in the middle of the woods. But I still have the panorama from there. And that one's actually interesting because before I joined the club, I mentioned my Marcy and Mansfield trip that kind of really got me started on it. My next trip after that was Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And at the time, Rhode Island was kind of difficult to get to because the land to get to it was privately owned. Okay. And I guess the guy that owned it was one of those grumpy old men that would yell at kids to get off his lawn. So it was, considered kind of one of the harder high points to get because of access reasons. But the club would have open access days where they would arrange with the landowners to provide access to the high point. So I think I had looked up on the club website what the open access days were, and went. It was in winter, so everything was snow covered. I actually have in the photograph, there's one of the big veteran members of the club speaking with some other people that were there. Like, he was kind of working the high point that day. Okay. And, so I got to meet him, and
cool.
I wasn't a member yet, but
it
was kind of my first little taste of it, I guess.
Oh, that's fun. What are the conventions like?
The conventions are fun. They usually run about 3 days. The big banquet is on Saturday night, but they have functions of some sort starting on Thursday. Sometimes there's group hikes. Sometimes it's just a social at one of the local watering holes. There's usually more stuff going on Saturday. There's a tradition called the Watermelon Feast, where apparently at the first convention, which had 12 people at it, somebody brought a watermelon, and they had it at the summit. It was on Mount Arvon in Michigan.
Okay.
And so it's one of those things that just stuck. Like, the next year, somebody brought another watermelon. And now it's like somebody brings a crate of watermelons because there's so many people now.
Wow.
If they have access to the summit for that many people, they'll actually do it at the summit.
Oh, that's cool.
Like Pennsylvania last year, the summit itself is like 100 yards from the parking lot. So they just set up a table in the parking lot and cut up the watermelon. And everybody has watermelon. And then there's a big banquet on Saturday night. So everybody goes. And that's usually where I have my pictures set up.
Okay.
If I don't have them set up somewhere else for the weekend. And everybody just kind of gets together and hangs out and eat. And then that's like the official club meeting for the year.
Mm-hmm.
Where like everyone is physically together. So the officers will say stuff and they'll do superlatives. So like they'll ask, who's got 50 high points? And those people stand up, and it's usually like a couple. And then who's got 49? And some more people stand up. And then they get down to like, who's got 2 high points? And those people stand up, and they're like, okay, everybody sit down. Who's got 1 high point? Or who came the farthest? Which is usually this guy from the Netherlands who comes every year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
How many high points does he have?
I'm not sure. If it's not 50, I believe it's in the 40s.
Wow.
Yeah. Who's the oldest one in attendance? Who's the youngest one in attendance? And it's usually either somebody in a wheelchair or like a newborn baby.
Yeah.
Both ends of the spectrum. It's fun. It's just a bunch of people that have, a common interest.
Right.
And it's not all extreme athletes by any means. It's, you got older guys with beer guts, and it's like, oh, that guy's got 50.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all types.
So when you tell your friends and family that you're high pointing, what do they say?
I think they're not always sure. Like, you kind of have to explain, like, it's the highest point of elevation in the state.
Yeah.
Of each state. They'll ask, like, does every state have a high point? Yes, every state has a high point.
Yeah. It has to.
Or they'll ask, like, what's New York's high point? Because it's usually people in New York I'm talking with.
Yeah.
Like, Mount Marcy up in the Adirondacks. They just see it as kind of a quirky thing.
It is.
Like I saw it at first. It is. Very quirky, niche hobby.
What do you think the benefits are that you get personally from high pointing?
Well, I love traveling in general. And so, I get to see parts of the country that I normally wouldn't have gone to before.
Yeah.
The northwest corner of Iowa is not on a lot of people's tourism list, but that's where Hawkeye Point is, and just the traveling in general part of it, and getting to, if you're a social person, getting to meet people at the conventions, and sometimes just meeting people on the summits, even outside the conventions. I think half the high points I've done, either it was just me or just me and my partner at the time. And we were the only ones. Like, there's no other hikers or anything. Coming down from Mount Bora after the eclipse, I ran into somebody from the club.
Oh.
So I chatted with them, and we hooked up after the climb and had dinner and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Do you like to high point with other people?
I've done, I think, maybe half a dozen or so with a friend from the club. I did the guided hike on Montana. So I made friends from that. And of course, Idaho, or 200 people at the top of that.
Right.
I actually met a minor celebrity during the eclipse hike. His name's Jeff Zausch, and he was on like Naked and Afraid, that survival show on, I think, Discovery.
Yeah.
He's been on some of those survival shows. So he was with a group of people at the summit, and I got talking with them, and like we're Facebook friends now, and
Oh, cool.
yeah,
That's fun.
we're like Delaware. I don't know if she's still there, but there used to be a lady that because the Delaware High Point is in a suburban neighborhood. Like if,
Yeah.
if you're not looking for it, you'll drive right past it.
Mm-hmm.
And there used to be a lady across the street who was like if she saw people doing the high point, she would come and greet them. And I think she had like a little pamphlet or something, and she would just talk to people. Like, it's not like she was officially employed by anybody to be the greeter for the high point. She just took it upon herself to do it.
That's fun.
So on Katahdin in Maine, because Katahdin is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail.
Right.
Starts in Spring Mountain, Georgia, I think, and then ends in Katahdin. So I'd summited in the morning, and I spent some time up there at the summit. And while I was up there, I got to see somebody finish the last 700-mile section of the Appalachian Trail.
Awesome.
So I got to see him coming up from the other side of the mountain that I'd come up from. And he got to the summit sign and he hugged it.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So I talked with him for a little bit, and I took his picture with the summit sign as part of one of my panoramas and sent it to him. So that was pretty neat.
That is neat.
I talked with Appalachian Trail through hikers at Mount Greylock, the high point of Massachusetts.
Okay.
Because I stayed at the lodge at the top in the bunk room. And so there's a bunch of AT hikers there. And I would have breakfast with them in the morning, and they would just tell me their stories of hiking the AT. And that's pretty neat, hearing those stories.
Which high point has been your favorite so far?
I think for overall experience, probably Granite Peak, Montana.
Okay.
Just from before even hitting the trail, like we had to meet in Cody, Wyoming to do a gear check and do some basic rock climbing in town to make sure that we could all do it. And the hike up to the plateau and the goats and the technical climbing part at the final couple hundred feet to the summit was really awesome. And made a couple friends. So overall experience, I would say Granite. As far as view from the top, like the eclipse on Bora was hard to beat. That was just,
for sure.
It was unreal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say Montana probably been my favorite so far.
Do you have any advice for listeners in terms of what to pack?
If you're doing hikes at altitude, don't underestimate like how cold it'll get.
Yeah.
Like when I did Montana, it was in August, and like down in town in Cody, it was sweltering hot. Like just sweat just dripping off you during the day. And we did a gear check, and our guide saw what I'd brought. Like I'd brought my 40-degree bag and what layers I'd brought with me. And he's like, you're going to need a warmer bag, and you're going to need another layer, like a fleece. And probably gloves.
Yeah.
So I had to go to the outfitter in town and buy a new sleeping bag and a 20-degree bag and a zip-up fleece. And I used them. They got cold. Like, even in the middle of August, you get up on the plateau, and yeah, I'm glad I had that extra equipment. Coming off of Wheeler Peak in New Mexico, which was another mini adventure, because the top was like gusting winds and snow up to our thighs, and we got back down to tree line, and there was this couple heading up the trail with like sneakers and like jean jacket. Like, I hope you're not planning on doing the summit today. You are not prepared.
What time of year was this?
Did Wheeler in October.
Okay.
So the summit ridge was just, we were getting blasted with wind and almost no visibility, and we were post-holing up to our thighs. It was,
you're kidding.
But, the whole trail, like, we stayed at Williams Lake at the base of the mountain for a night.
Okay.
And then the switchbacks going up the side of the mountain, those were okay. Like, there'd be places where the trail had been drifted over, so we're kind of breaking up the drifts on our way up so that it'd be easier on the way down. And then we hit the summit ridge, and the wind was coming from the other side of the mountain, and like, it was a wind you had to lean into a little bit. And it was, oof. Luckily, it's not very far from where you get onto the summit ridge to the summit. So
you're right. Yeah.
We did it, got our pictures, and then got off that ridge because it was nasty.
Yeah.
It was cold. It apparently has nice views. I don't know.
Yeah, it does. It's really beautiful. I was there in August of 2021, I think. Of course, that's the off season in Taos Ski Village. So I found a really cheap, beautiful place to stay there. And the day, I mean, I just lucked out. The day was perfect. But I remember there was like a little gust of wind. And I remember thinking, I would never want to be here if it was any windier than this.
Yeah, it was crazy. Like, just that little section at the top was crazy. The rest of it was fine.
Well, and I had a similar experience when I was coming back down and I approached the tree line. I saw people who were not really well prepared. Not that it's like a really difficult hike when the weather's nice, but they were in regular street shoes, jeans. You would not look at them and go, oh, they're going on a hike. And it was 2 or 3 p.m. and they were walking really slow. And they were like, are we close? Yeah. And I was like,
they're asking that?
Yeah. And I was like, well, the best thing I could do is to be honest with them. And so I was like, you're not, and you should consider turning around. They didn't listen though. There's no way they had a headlamp either.
Yeah. The tree line, you're just starting the hard part.
Exactly. Exactly. Literally before that, it's a walk in the woods.
Yeah. I remember once doing Mount Driscoll in Louisiana.
Okay.
On a convention road trip. And it was really, really hot that year. And Driscoll's not very hard at all. It's like, I think maybe a half-mile walk from the parking lot, and it's mostly flat. But I was walking down the trail, and like, it was so hot that like my body started not feeling right. I started feeling weird. And I lived in Texas for almost 5 years, but I don't recall ever feeling this kind of heat. It was brutal.
Yeah.
So even on a small hike, make sure you bring water and all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
That was a nasty hike. Like Arkansas, where the convention was, that was just nasty hot. Yeah, I didn't even do any hiking aside from the high point, which is really easy because I just didn't want to be out in it.
No.
Yeah. I'd rather hike in 20-degree weather than like 90 plus humidity. I'm
there with you on that. Only because, I lived in Rochester for a little while. So I'm familiar with upstate New York winters. I mean, there were times when I would walk outside and I couldn't find my car because it was buried in snow.
Yeah, usually, 2-3 times a winter we'll get just socked with, feet of snow.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite outdoor adventure books or documentaries or podcasts?
One podcast I've been listening to lately called The Trip That Changed Me.
Okay.
And it's these travelers that talk about like one particular trip that triggered their love for travel.
Wow.
Was really meaningful in their lives. So that's been pretty interesting. There's the Dear Bob and Sue podcast.
What's it called?
Dear Bob and Sue.
Okay.
It's this couple that was trying to travel to all the national parks, and they would write emails back to their friends Bob and Sue. And so they made a book out of it, and now they have a podcast, and it's a bit more of a travel guide kind of podcast.
Okay.
They talk about what they did in the park and how you can do those same things, and, general like logistic type stuff for doing the parks.
Mm-hmm. Well, I always like to get that information from people because, like what we do between highpointing or traveling to national parks, it's not a spectator sport. And I know that when you read about it, it can really enrich your life and give you new ideas and maybe some inspiration. What would you tell someone who is thinking about, maybe they don't have a lot of adventure in their life? What would you say to them between that and highpointing?
If you want to get out there and, go on adventures, just plan it and do it.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully they have vacation time and you don't need a ton of money. Some of them you need a ton of money. But, to get into highpointing, most of them are going to be day trips.
Yeah.
If you're just wanting to have more adventure and wanting to get back into nature or out into nature for the first time, start with the easier, like Eastern Peaks.
Yeah.
Like Mount Rogers in Virginia is an easy hike. Plus, you have ponies.
How has it enriched your life specifically?
I have more stories to tell. I've gotten a lot of, good photographs for my, for what I do with it.
Mm-hmm.
I've met a lot of interesting people. Yeah, I just get to see a lot of places. I've been to all 50 states now because of it.
Really?
Yep. Missouri was my last state.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah. So yeah, any kind of travel to me just enriches my life.
I agree.
Just a weekend getaway to a week long road trip, or I just love it.